Hello and welcome to the Athletic FC podcast with me, Akinwolere. England have chosen a permanent successor to Gareth Southgate. Why has Tuchel been chosen? And does he offer the best chance of winning the World Cup? I'm joined by the Athletics football correspondent David Ornstein and our England writer Jack Pitt-Brooke. Jack, let's come to you first. Thomas Tuchel is the new England manager. He starts work on the 1st of January 2025. Look, it was only a few days ago we were fantasizing that Pep Guardiola could potentially be getting the England job. Are you surprised by this appointment?
I think if you'd asked me at the start of the process, would I be surprised if Thomas Tuchel is the next permanent England manager? I would not have been because I think Tuchel's always been one of the outstanding candidates. He's got a great track record. He's out of work as well at the moment, which I think helps his case. That said, it's all moved very, very quickly in the last week or so. The FA statement that just came out said that he signed his contract on the 8th of October. So that was last Tuesday. And frankly, not many people at that point would have known that Tuchel was about to become the England manager. So I think it's more the speed of it that has surprised me rather than the outcome.
Yeah. How much do you think Lee Carsley's performance as interim manager, I guess, sped up the process? If we're talking about, him signing the contracts in October, I mean, also, I'm looking at Lee Carsley, and I guess some might say probably not as convincing when speaking to the press. Do you think a lot of that would have had, an impact on potentially moving Thomas Tuchel forward in taking this job?
I don't think it would have had an impact on the process in the sense that if the FA are right and Tuchel signed the contract on the 8th of October, that's 2 days before the disastrous home defeat to Greece last Thursday. It's before the Finland game, and it's before Carsley had struggled with all the questions about whether or not he wanted the top job. That said, I think what we have seen from Carsley in England over the last week will have probably reinforced some minds at the FA that maybe it's not quite the right time for Carsley to take over the top job because the team was so poor against Greece, and also because Carsley did struggle a bit, I think, in those press conferences. He struggled to articulate whether or not he wanted the job. Now, it might well be that he knew, perhaps at this point, that Tuchel was coming in, and therefore maybe he thought it was slightly academic whether or not he wanted a job that was not going to be his. But
Mm.
I just wonder if that might have kind of encouraged people at the FA they were going down the right path with Tuchel.
Yeah. Do you see this as a bold appointment from the FA? I mean, he's a very well decorated manager at club level. How influential do you think his style of football will be for this England team? How influential do you think he as a man will be in this position?
Well, I think it's bold in the sense that he's a big name. He's won the
Mm.
Champions League. I think he's one of the most impressive managers of his generation. He's worked all over Europe, usually with a lot of success. I think the jury is out on whether or not you can just take a big name club manager into international football and see them replicate their success. There's lots of examples of big name managers coming in and maybe not having the success they're expected. I'm thinking of, Antonio Conte with Italy, Luis Enrique with Spain, Hansi Flick with Germany, all different cases. But it's not always a given that just because you've won the Champions League, you can come into international football and win there. Some of the most successful managers in international football are in fact guys who don't really have much of a club CV. De La Fuente with Spain, Scaloni with Argentina, even arguably Southgate with England. So I don't think there's no guarantees that he will succeed. I do think he's a big name, and I think we just have to wait and see how able he is to imprint his style of play on players, given that he's only going to be working with them for a week or two at a time.
Yeah, when thinking about Thomas Tuchel, I think about his successes, but also think about, I guess, great fallouts with the higher echelons of clubs, right? Yeah, whether it be Dortmund, whether it be Bayern Munich, or even to a certain degree, Leonardo, and PSG. Um, do we have a sense of what kind of relationship this will be with the FA? Because Thomas Tuchel is a guy that clearly has a set idea of principles of how he wants to do things.
Yeah, I wonder if he might find this a bit easier than some of the club situations he's been in the past, just because, the FA is not a football club. And there's fewer people in the building getting in his ear, so particularly, and there's no recruitment either. So there's no arguments about should we sign him or should we sign him or should we sign him. And clearly, when he was particularly at PSG and at Bayern, there's a lot of politics going on at those clubs, and And as you say, Tuchel is somebody with very, very clear ideas about how he wants to do things. So I don't think that's going to be an issue in the same way. Obviously, in the past, he's also rubbed some players up the wrong way. I don't know whether that will be quite so much of an issue with England simply because he's not working with the players 24/7. Club again, international football is different from club football. So it might be that that aspect of it isn't so much of an issue. So it might well be that he really enjoys the kind of extra sort of freedom and autonomy that you get working as a national manager rather than with a club.
Yeah, Jack's just been talking about, how he feels Tuchel could settle into this England setup and also his relationship with the FA, David. Do you see this appointment as a bold appointment from the FA?
Bold in some ways. He's German. He has had relatively short stints at the big clubs that he's worked for: Borussia Dortmund, PSG, Chelsea, Bayern Munich. And so it doesn't come without its risks. I'm not sure anybody comes without their risks. And, not everybody, very few have such squeaky clean CVs as Gareth Southgate. But on the footballing side, there aren't many bigger, better, you could say, names within football management. And we can see that Thomas Tuchel is one of the elite coaches, managers in the game. He ticks a lot of the criteria that the FA had set out in terms of Premier League experience, in terms of winning trophies, in terms of developing young players, in particular English players, which he did at Chelsea, likes of Reece James, Mason Mount. Mason Mount, this could be a good thing for. And so, yeah, of course, it's bold because they're backing Thomas Tuchel to take England to World Cup glory. And it's a job that he has wanted for a long time. It's been well documented. Myself and others have reported it. He'll have total faith in himself to conquer that task and to achieve what nobody has in what will be 60 years, I think. This is an enormous moment for English football. They've tried big foreign names before. I'm not sure any of those in terms of Capello and Sven-Göran Eriksson were kind of at their sort of peak within club football at that moment in time. That they had done well in the past, but Tuchel is seen as the sort of manager who's in the frame for Manchester United, reportedly. If Erik ten Hag was to have left now, we know he was in the summer because he was interviewed when there was a decision to make on Erik ten Hag. So this is the Football Association setting their sights high. It's almost like a club football appointment. This is somebody that will go to the World Cup in 2026 in the United States, Canada, and Mexico, provided England qualify, and have more, certainly club football titles to his name than anybody else there. He's a bigger name than pretty much any other manager that will be there. And I'll come back to finish this answer on bold and me saying, because he's German, with the point that he is a big Anglophile. This is a guy who speaks pretty much perfect English. He loves England. I've seen him even before he got the job at PSG, I think, on his way to watch Pep Guardiola's Manchester City. He was in and amongst sort of fans on the way there, flat cap on. He seemed to love the British culture and football and society. He relished his job at Chelsea, even though it was relatively short. He connected with those players. He became a bit of a cult hero to the Chelsea fans who miss him to this day. And so, okay, maybe he's not a darling of the British public like maybe Jurgen Klopp, because he had been with Liverpool for so long. He'd become such a charismatic figure. He'd won a lot and challenged for even more. And there was this feeling that up there with Pep Guardiola, who was the FA's top choice, and maybe Jurgen Klopp had been in there at one point as well. Okay, Thomas Tuchel has not sort of ingrained himself in English society in quite the same way as those two. But of all of the options that were available, and look, there is hugely polarizing reaction to this on whether England should go for an English coach, whether they should go for a foreign coach, whether a German will be accepted in, how quickly will the press and the public turn on somebody like him if it doesn't go right. I don't think England could have done much better. And I think given what's happened of late with Lee Carsley and the uncertainty and England fans baying for somebody that can take them that 1% further that Gareth Southgate didn't manage to do and go on to be the actual winner. Looking at Tuchel's record in semi-finals with Chelsea, I think he's unbeaten with all but one of those matches being a win, and that was a draw. He went on to a final every time. He's won 3 major league titles. He's won the Champions League. Looking at what they had at their disposal to try and lift that tournament, they probably couldn't have done much better than Thomas Tuchel.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that, Manchester United were interested in the summer. We know that for sure. Do you think that was a bit of a consideration for the FA to get this job done, to get it over the line, just in case something else does come along down the line? Because, he's an elite manager and there might be a few jobs out there that he could still be considering.
Well, Thomas Tuchel has wanted to resume management in England. That's been crystal clear. So whether it had been with England previously, with Tottenham Hotspur, with Manchester United, there was no disguising his desire. So for somebody that does want to employ him, there is this sense of you better move fast because you don't know where he might end up, because coaches of that ilk don't stay on the market for too long generally. I remember when Arsenal were considering changing Arsene Wenger after 22 years in charge in the spring of 2018. Thomas Tuchel was available then. He was put forward to them. I think he would have loved that opportunity to build at a club, a project with time and patience. That's his dream. And I think he was very fond of Arsenal. And Arsenal at that moment in time, do things by the book, didn't want to interview and speak to people behind Arsene Wenger's back. And they said, no, thanks. We've got a manager for the time being. Thomas Tuchel was then approached by PSG very quickly, struck a deal with them, accepted it, signed, was appointed. And lo and behold, Arsenal parted with Arsene Wenger and may well have been looking for somebody like Thomas Tuchel. So fast forward to now, it may have been a consideration for the FA, but I've got to say, I'm not aware of Manchester United moving for him. There were reports, and I respect all of those reports, that if Erik ten Hag had gone, he would have been high in their consideration. I've said in other broadcast appearances and pods that I'm not sure that Manchester United would have gone back there. I think there were some reservations after what happened in the summer. Exactly how it played out, we might not ever know, but there was certainly some interest from Thomas Tuchel's side. That married with some interest from Manchester United's side. They came together. They had some conversations. Whether offers or numbers were thrown around, who knows? But Thomas Tuchel then decided to back off because he wanted longer away. And depending on how far Manchester United had gone down the road with him, was it once bitten, twice shy? And if the vacancy had arisen or does arise, maybe they would be looking elsewhere. But I'm not sure the FA would have known all of that. And so there was a lot of noise around Thomas Tuchel. And now we hear about the dates they're claiming that he signed. It does draw parallels. Manchester United were holding their ExCo meeting, no doubt discussing Erik ten Hag's future that day off the back of the Aston Villa draw. And the FA seemed to have acted with stealth under the radar and got their man. I think less dramatic and more probable is that they needed to make an appointment. Mark Bullingham, the chief executive, to my understanding, wanted a big name. Tuchel's conversations would have taken place for quite some time. His desire has been made clear. And so they wanted to get it wrapped up. And it may explain now some of Lee Carsley's comments and uncertainty in the days that followed.
Okay. Jack, David just spoke about Mark Bullingham, and Mark Bullingham also in an FA statement says, appointing Tuchel is about giving us the best possible chance to win the World Cup in 2026. Something David also spoke about was time and patience. Is that enough time with this squad? And do England fans have enough patience if they don't see someone get into this job and see quick results and quick, beautiful play, to say the least?
It's not a lot of time at all. You know, his first England camp will be late March next year, and then he'll only have what just over a year with the players really before that is assuming they qualify before they all fly off to the US in June 2026. So it's a very tight turnaround. And I guess this is kind of the issue with the appointment is that if you appoint somebody who is kind of explicitly there to win the World Cup, then you are setting the bar so high that it's going to be very difficult for this appointment to be viewed as a success unless they are lifting the World Cup trophy in July 2026. And I guess this is kind of the problem, isn't it? When you appoint somebody so that they can win you a trophy, you do make life very difficult for yourself. You know, it's impossible for me not to think about the example of Tottenham Hotspur, who sacked Mauricio Pochettino in 2019 and replaced him with Jose Mourinho because he was a proven winner, thinking that all the winning that he'd done could kind of rub off on the club. And of course, it didn't happen that way. And it didn't happen with Antonio Conte either. And now Tottenham have had to go back to thinking, what sort of a club do we want to be? How are we gonna try and build from scratch? Now, of course, international and club football are different, but I think the logic of the proven winner appointment, I think, is never. I don't really think it often works out quite how people expect it will. In terms of the patience from the fans, well, I think a lot of it will boil down. I mean, this is an obvious thing to say, but of course, it will all boil down to how they do in the US. You know, the fans won't care too much, I don't think, if performances are not great between now and then. But if they slip up in the US, then I think people will turn pretty quickly.
Yeah, look, there's plenty of talent in this squad, especially very young talent. But and I guess this will be something that will be brought up, I'm sure, as Thomas Tuchel stays in the job, is that, what does hiring a German manager say about English coaching talent, Jack?
Not a lot, really. I mean, the idea is that the FA. Sorry, let me start that again. Um, Not a lot, really. I mean, I think that I don't. My own view on this is that certainly at the top level, international teams should be managed by people from that country. I think that given all the money in the English game, there ought to be coach education and coaching pathways sufficient to produce an English manager for the English national team. I think it's pretty depressing if the FA don't think that there is a sufficiently good English candidate for the role. Um, I think that a lot of the successes of Gareth Southgate over the last 8 years were down to him working very hard to try to build a kind of authentic English identity around the English England team, realizing that the England team is not just a 21st Premier League club. It's actually a kind of, it's a kind of culture in itself, and you need the players to buy into that. You need the public to buy into that. So I think that England have really gone down the route of swallowing the logic of club football and Premier League football by getting a famous manager in. I've got no doubt that Tuchel is a brilliant manager, but I think it is a bit, personally, I think it's a bit dispiriting what it says to us about both English coaching pathways and also the priorities of the FA.
Yeah, I mean, look, you're talking to a Nigerian, so I'm used to foreign coaches taking over my national team to a certain degree. So I know I'm sort of in the middle on that one, really, in terms of someone from the country holding, taking that national team position. But David, in that vein as well, did England approach Pep Guardiola? Do we know? Would he have been first choice, for instance?
Well, the FA has run a confidential process, so very little official is going to come out from their end. So you have to rely on your sourcing and information. And I have spoken to multiple people who say there was an approach over the summer. Certainly, I was getting indications around mid to late August time into September that Pep Guardiola was the top choice. I believe that to be the case. and understandably so. I mean, he'd probably be the top choice for any club or international team in world football, and especially for England with his experience here and his success and everything that they're looking for, his work with English players. There is nobody who ticks more boxes than him. And so, yeah, it seems some informal contact took place. They sort of sounded him out. Those reports emerged earlier this week. And the thing with Pep Guardiola is he tends to change his mind from one day to the next, leaves his decisions relatively late. So when he signed his last contract at Manchester City in 2002, I remember breaking the story when we were out at the World Cup. So that would have been mid to late November, early December, approaching the final 6 months of his terms. And it looks like it's going to be the same again this time around. And so the FA... I think they got some sort of positive indications, like there was an openness to have a further conversation. But how far can you wait in their position with everything at stake and the importance of this appointment and the time to go until the World Cup? And they could have waited all of that time, and Pep Guardiola could have extended his contract at Manchester City, and then the FA would have been left in a very tricky position. In recent days, when the Pep Guardiola story started to emerge, I was led to believe that it was more likely he would do another year at City than take the England job right now. So the FA would have been cognizant of their chances, and that's clearly why they've shifted to Thomas Tuchel. I don't think that's a slight on Tuchel. He was actually he is somebody that has looked up to Pep Guardiola for many years. As I mentioned earlier, he studied him. He went to Man City games. They've spoken a lot. They ended up being sparring partners, and actually Tuchel turned the tables on Pep Guardiola in the Champions League final when City were heavy favourites and Chelsea came out with the win. And that's led them to become rivals, but there's great respect and admiration there. So I don't think he'll be offended by the fact that the FA would have loved to appoint Pep Guardiola. And the FA's admiration for Guardiola is ongoing. Understandably so. And therefore, you never know what the future might hold. Could they go for him post Tuchel? May he go and do something else? Let's see. It's interesting on Guardiola that as this drew closer, I started to get the sense that it would be more plausible than many thought, because a lot of people were saying the finances just wouldn't work. But Guardiola's not stupid. If he wanted this job, he would adapt his salary expectations accordingly, I'm sure. And also the FA would have had means to have taken the package higher. So yeah, it seems that Thomas Tuchel has fitted in pretty much to what they wanted. There's a bonus in his contract for winning the World Cup, as you would expect. And it is more cost effective than hiring Pep Guardiola, no doubt. But in Pep Guardiola's personal and commercial endorsement deals, the idea that he would manage one of the premier international teams in England and at a World Cup in North America, United States, Canada, Mexico, would have seen a massive uplift there, which I'm sure would have gone some way to plugging the shortfall between the FA salary offer and what he gets paid at Manchester City. So that was a real situation, Io, and it hasn't materialised. Maybe it will in the future, maybe not. And they would have been looking at other candidates. Mark Bullingham says they held discreet interviews, or at least conversations, sounded out people. So you think maybe the likes of Graham Potter, who the FA have admired the work of for many years, and rightly so. And he's also a good talker, carries himself well, and maybe a bit of a squeaky clean image along the lines of Gareth Southgate, and he's English. Then you've got people like Eddie Howe, but I'm getting the impression that he was not a serious contender for the position. I think he's pretty firmly invested in the projects at Newcastle United, and there would have been salary questions to be answered there. Again, I'm not suggesting it would have definitely been an impediment. But ultimately, I don't think the list probably went too much further. And again, all things considered, Pep Guardiola would have been a dream, but Thomas Tuchel is not a bad alternative.
Yeah, for sure. All right, gents, I'll let you go. I know you've got lots happening today. Thanks for joining us, Jack and David, as well. Time to dig a little deeper on what England fans can expect from Thomas Tuchel. Before we get into Tuchel's time in England at Chelsea, the Athletic's German football correspondent Seb Stafford-Bloor is on hand to tell us how he fared in his most recent job at Bayern Munich.
I think if Tuchel was to reflect now, he would say that might have been a mistake to take that job mid-season. Julian Nagelsmann was sacked in March 2023, which of course creates an unexpected opportunity and probably a chance he felt might not come again and that he was unable to turn down. But he still inherited a really flawed squad. Robert Lewandowski was gone. Bayern were midway through their Sadio Mane experiment, which didn't really work. Defence was a bit of a mess. Midfield was imbalanced. Tuchel inherited all of these things, and not during a pre-season when he had a chance to remedy some of them, or during a transfer window. And over time, his angst over those deficiencies grew, and that became the kind of the feature of his time at Allianz Arena. I think the decisive moment is really in the summer of 2023, when he clearly had an idea of exactly what he wanted, which positions needed strengthening. And throughout that summer, a lot of Bayern's organisational energy was consumed by their pursuit of Harry Kane, to the point where they left a lot of things undone. And over time, Tuchel became less and less shy of expressing his disappointment at some of these recruiting failures, or what he perceived to be recruitment failures. He would also talk publicly about what he perceived players' weaknesses to be, and it created a lot of friction, not just within the dressing room, where a lot of players felt unwanted by him, and they felt that some of his man management style contrasted unfavourably with Julian Nagelsmann. Also caused problems higher up. It was very draining.
Well, that was Seb Stafford-Bloor on Thomas Tuchel's time at Bayern Munich. Well, joining me now to talk about Tuchel at Chelsea is Liam Twomey, who covers the Blues for The Athletic. Liam, let's first talk about his career at Chelsea and what that arc looked like. What were the good bits? Obviously, winning the Champions League, I imagine, would be on the highs, but also what were the low bits from your perspective?
I think the arc is pretty pronounced in terms of the highs and the lows. And you look at his Chelsea tenure, he only had one full season. It's basically 18 months, 19 months. And it felt like 5 years worth of events were packed into that time. Let's talk initially about his immediate impact, because Chelsea was the first time that he'd taken a job mid-season. And it took him as long as the flight from Paris to London to come up with the system that ultimately won Chelsea the Champions League. It's easy to forget Chelsea were a team that were drifting on the pitch, that didn't really have a coherent identity with all the spending that they'd done in the summer of 2020. And Tuchel changed all of that virtually overnight. He transformed Chelsea into a defensive behemoth. They went 14 games unbeaten from the start of his tenure and only conceded 2 goals. It was their defense and their smothering pressing that got them past Atletico Madrid, then Real Madrid, and ultimately beat Manchester City 3 times in the space of 2 months, culminating in that incredible Champions League final in Porto. There was an FA Cup final defeat against Leicester in all of that as well, but those first 3-4 months were pretty much as impressive as it gets, I think, for examples of a high-end coach come in and making just an incredible immediate impact and getting the most spectacular reward for it. So he immediately earned the undying goodwill of the Chelsea fan base. And he went into that 2021-22 season with real momentum. You know, Abramovich had given him a new contract. He'd also given him a new striker in Romelu Lukaku. And that's when things started to go wrong for Tuchel. I mean, they began that season pretty strongly, but by the turn of the year, it was already pretty clear that their defensive standards had slipped a little bit from the Champions League winning peak, and their attack had not improved, even with the addition of Lukaku, to make up for that defensive slippage. And then you have Lukaku giving that interview to Sky Italia, which torched his relationship with Chelsea as well as with Tuchel. And Tuchel, I think, still emerged with a lot of credit for winning the Club World Cup, and also getting Chelsea to 2 more cup finals that season. I mean, he got Chelsea to the final of every cup competition he competed in. It's an incredible record, and one that I think England might have looked at quite closely, because you are appointing a cup manager ultimately. He also provided, I think, some important leadership for the club when the UK government sanctioned Abramovich and everything that went along with that, and what an unprecedented, stressful situation it was. I think he was a good front-facing leader at a time when there weren't many of those at Chelsea. But there were already signs behind the scenes that he was perceived very differently by his players. And Lukaku was not the only one who was disillusioned with his management style as well as his style of play. A lot of the attackers felt alienated by the way he used, but also spoke to them and about them in games and in training. He's very demonstrative with his frustration when chances were missed. He was, we were told at the time, even more brutal with his feedback in training. And players also felt that as his reign went on and performances and results started to dip, the culture of open communication that he'd established on his arrival really fell by the wayside, and players were suddenly being blanked, and it wasn't explained to them what they had to do to get back into the team. And it meant that when the change of ownership actually happened, Todd Boehly and Clear Lake Capital inherited a club with a lot of problems, but one of those problems was that quite a lot of players wanted to leave for several reasons, but one of them being to get away from their head coach. And that was a difficult situation to try and manage. And the power vacuum at the top of the club plunged Tuchel into more of an active role in recruitment in that summer than he would have liked. He was not diplomatic in hiding his frustration with Boehly and Badad Eghbali as they got up to speed with the football business. Boehly, obviously, functioning as interim sporting director, and those key relationships broke down very, very quickly, in marked contrast to the relationships he'd had with Marina Granovskaya and Petr Cech, which were always very good and very close. And so remarkably, it wasn't a huge surprise when his 100th match as Chelsea coach against Dinamo Zagreb in Zagreb proved to be his last. Maybe Chelsea were slightly more brutal than we were expecting, but there were signs that it was heading in that direction, because he'd lost the trust of the boardroom and he'd also lost the trust of a lot of the dressing room.
Yeah, I mean, super comprehensive there. And I wonder what England fans will be thinking. This is clearly a coach with a sense of what he wants to do at a club, but also a real sense of self as well, it seems. I wonder, from your perspective, having seen him at Chelsea, if you, one, think international football suits him and the way he operates, and two, I guess, what kind of football should England fans expect?
I think when you look at the things that worked at Chelsea early on, there's a lot to be optimistic about from an England point of view. He imposed a level of tactical detail and rigor in very little amount of training time. It did not take much time for him to get his message across and to ensure that his team was really joined up. And within a matter of weeks, Chelsea were playing at the level that subsequently led them to win the Champions League. So if you're looking from an international point of view where you don't get much time to work with players, when you've maybe got 2-3 weeks in a camp before you go off to a tournament, I think he's capable of doing that. And everyone, even people who don't like Tuchel personally or have questions about him professionally, they all say he's a world-class tactical mind. This guy is an incredible boots on the ground coach in terms of the way that he sets up teams. And there are very few people in world football, I think, that would be backed to come up with the right game plan for a big one-off game, which is ultimately how international tournaments are won and lost, and where England have fallen short, I think, throughout the Southgate era. So I can certainly see the logic from that perspective in the FA turning to Tuchel. Where the questions are his ability to manage people, both up and down, Can he be a company man in the way that Southgate was? I think a lot of the people that have experienced Tuchel in his career would be very skeptical of that. With all of the media scrutiny that comes with being England manager, it's unlike anything else in this country, a different level even from Chelsea. And can he navigate dressing room dynamics for a long period of time without alienating players that he actually needs to be successful? He did that really well for a few months at Chelsea, and then it disintegrated quite quickly. And there have been reports of that happening at his other previous clubs. So I think there are serious questions and serious risks to this, but I can absolutely see why the FA arrived at a place where they wanted to do it.
Okay, well, his assistant at England is a guy called Anthony Barry, and it's talked up a lot actually by the FA in today's statement. And what do you think of him and his time at Chelsea with Tuchel as well?
Well, the interesting thing about Anthony Barry, and something I think that's been the theme of his career, is that he impresses everyone who comes into contact with him. He came to Chelsea because he'd done his pro license at the same time as Frank Lampard and Jody Morris. And they came away thinking, wow, this guy is so good. There was no kind of formal ranking of students in that pro license intake, but from what I was told, informally, he was regarded as, the top student in the class. And that's not just as a set piece coach, which is how he's come to be known. I think he's very well respected for being a football mind generally. But the interesting thing about him and his Chelsea time is that when Lampard left and most of his backroom staff left with him, Barry was technically a club hire, even though Lampard had certainly pushed for him to come in. And he was in two minds when Tuchel was appointed about whether he could stay, because he's always had offers to go and be a head coach in lower tiers in England and abroad, I think. So he had a decision to make, and from what we were told, Tuchel came in and immediately formed such a positive impression of him and his level of knowledge that he was like, I can't lose this guy. He has to be a key part of my backroom team going forward. And so he stayed. He convinced Barry to stay. And you would often see him. It was clear what the division of responsibilities was. Every time there was a corner or a free kick, Tuchel would be down. Barry would be up in the technical area, issuing instructions. So that's clearly his specialism, but I don't think it's all that he does. And the impression that I've had of him since then, even though I've not been quite as connected to it since he's left Chelsea, is that he continues to be someone that is regarded almost universally with respect for how competent he is, and he's been with Belgium, working with Roberto Martinez, who seems to be a big fan of him as well, and he's still really young. So it looks like he's got a lot of potential for future growth in his career as well.
Yeah, really nice to hear that, Liam. And thanks for that really comprehensive, in-depth look at Thomas Tuchel's time at Chelsea. And of course, Thomas Tuchel, now England manager. Appreciate your time, brother. Now, to pick the bones out of his first press conference, I'm joined by the Athletic's Phil Hay. Phil, I was listening to Thomas Tuchel's first press conference not long ago, and, he felt assured. He felt secure. And I wonder if that had to do with the fact that he's probably met a lot of those journalists already from his time at Chelsea.
Familiar faces in the room. You made this point just before we came on air, and I hadn't really thought of it, but I think it's right on the money that he'll be walking in there and seeing people who he recognises from his time at Chelsea. You've got all the top tier of your English football writers in the room, as they would be at most Chelsea games as well. His English is rock solid for a start, which definitely helps. So no issues with communication, and he did look really relaxed. I thought his personality came across really well. Actually, he was good humoured. I think he will have been well aware of what was coming, even without the briefing that he'll inevitably have had from the FA's communications department. He'll have followed what's been said over the last 24 hours. He'll have seen the positive aspects of the coverage. He'll have seen the negative critical aspects of either him as a coach or him as a foreigner or a German, whatever it is that people are digging him out for. And he seemed ready for it all. I thought, I'm always wary really with these because I've seen a lot of new manager press conferences in my career, but I'm always wary of saying that anybody spoke well because people tend to speak well. It's more newsworthy if they come in for the press conference, the first press conference, and give a bad impression. But I don't think anybody will go away from that thinking that he isn't ultra keen for the job. And I think in the cold light of day as well, when you think about Tuchel, he has got an elite track record when it comes to the clubs that he's managed. And he is a coach who's been pulled from the top shelf, really.
Something you mentioned there about his nationality, and that will always seem to be a factor, especially with the press in the UK and England. And he was asked that already in the press conference. And I don't know, I think he handled it really, really well, almost as if he was prepared for that, being a German leading an England team.
Yeah, there was a really good piece that Jack Pitt-Brooke wrote yesterday. It was on The Athletic, and it was his view on why the England coach should be English. For what it's worth, I disagree. I see this from a different point of view, but it was a really eloquent article. And when you read it, you really got Jack's point of view. Parts of the other coverage I've seen just seem to be totally deranged. I was reading a piece yesterday that was referencing Henry V, and I get that Agincourt was a kind of memorable away day, but it's similar to me using the Battle of Bannockburn to debate the appointment of a coach for Scotland. And it's, from my point of view, football's really cosmopolitan, never been more so these days. And I think the lines between nationality and tradition have blurred more and more over the years. And in the end, everybody says they want England to win. And I think with Tuchel, they've got as good a chance as they ever had with Southgate, regardless of how far Southgate got with this squad. But again, you're right. He was prepared for those questions. And I think he probably struck the balance pretty well between being slightly apologetic, where he said, look, I'm sorry, I've got a German passport. There's not a lot I can do about that. But not being so apologetic to the point where he was saying, yeah, do you know what? You're all right. They should have an English coach here, but they don't have anybody who's up to it, or there's nobody that the FA trusts. So it's had to be me. He did say at one point, again, people who take that point of view, I accept that, they're entitled to that opinion, but here I am. It was notable, I thought, that the FA's Chief Executive Mark Bullingham swerved that question completely when it came. The question of what does it say about you that you can't have an English coach in this job? He didn't address that at all. And to a degree, I can understand why, because again, the last thing he wants to sit and do is say, we really rate Thomas, we think he can win us the World Cup, we think he's the right man for the job. But actually, if there had been somebody who was tailor-made in English, we'd have gone for them instead.
Something that also came up for me was people were pointing out that he's only got an 18-month contract, and I loved his answers. I'd have to work on my long game. That's what I'm working on, something along those lines. And I wonder whether or not he's thinking about his time moving forward at England, or whether it's a job at hand, and whether or not he can actually convert his club success into national team success.
I just think it's sensible. I mean, it's not so different with Mauricio Pochettino over at the USMNT. It's the same thing. They're both very high profile, but they're both moving into international management for the first time. And it is a different code of coaching. It isn't the same. I was writing about Bielsa at Uruguay earlier this week and saying, people who know him say that to a degree he does miss. He's not unhappy with that job. He was pleased to take it on, but he does miss day-to-day chaos of, managing a club. So it is different for them. Add to that the fact that both of them are expensive. And also, the reality that both of them have to deliver a good performance at the World Cup. Quite what Pochettino's target with the USMNT is difficult to say. I don't know what would pass as clearing the bar for him. But for Tuchel in England, especially after the last Euros and a couple of the tournaments before that as well, they have to go very close to winning in 2026. They have to be right there, and it has to look like it's working and it's a good fit. And it just seems to me to be a fairly sensible point post World Cup to review everything. And I don't doubt that if it's going well and Tuchel's comfortably in the job, that you'll see a contract extension at that point. I think in a lot of ways a really long contract, which seems to give somebody almost undue security, given that they're coming into this fairly raw in international terms, is as much of a risk as a short-term deal.
Yeah, I'm sure many England fans also would like the fact that he's worked with Harry Kane before, and this is a reunification of that relationship. But also, I guess he has got the template that someone like Gareth Southgate built, young, dynamic players who are hungry for success?
I think so. I do think the squad that's been left behind is in very, very good nick for him. Not perfect. And I think, without eulogising about Southgate, because I think there were issues with him, and I think particularly it was the in-game coaching finesse needed to tweak matches and turn them when they weren't going well, which seemed to count against him more than anything. But there are a lot of players who are well established. There are a lot of top draw players, and I mean the credit for that to a large extent has to go to the clubs that they're coming from, because that's where they're coached and trained every day. But he is inheriting a really, really strong group. And again, just to compare him quickly with Pochettino, I think whereas the USMNT squad needs a little bit of a magic wand waved over it, I think what the England squad needs is just somebody who can work out where the players fit best in order to make them the best team that they can be. And I reckon that it was probably quite helpful, Lee Carsley proving last week, this caretaker game against Greece, that just trying to shoehorn every quality attacking player into the team is not going to work and is not a good strategy. You need to be more strategic than that. And Tuchel definitely will be. So yeah, in terms of Harry Kane, fascinates me really, because he and Kane obviously have a prior history at Bayern Munich, but there does seem to be a prevailing view that Kane's presence in the team, as much as he scores goals, has been a hindrance more than a help recently, if that isn't going too far. There's no doubt at all that Kane is into the sort of latter years of his career as well. And there is going to come a day, a little bit like David Beckham, where England will have to move on from him. And you wonder whether that might fall in the Tuchel era. Possibly not, because I think Kane's still got some lead in his pencil. But, beyond 2026, it's hard to see where Kane would fit. Yeah.
And finally, we were talking about how his personality might sit in this England squad and within the FA, blanket in general. He spoke about being an emotional guy, which I thought was really interesting. He's not a company man, I guess, in the same way as someone like Gareth Southgate is. How do you think those personalities will work together, the FA as Thomas Tuchel?
It's funny, I always think company man as a description of Southgate, which is pretty unfair. I think maybe federation coach is a better way of putting it. That's become like the sort of fashionable phrase, as a la De La Fuente over in Spain and others. Lee Carsley would have been an extension of that, wouldn't he? Although interested in Carsley, obviously Irish himself rather than English, so it doesn't really resolve that debate. But I just got the feeling that this time round the FA realised that promoting from within wasn't necessarily going to be credible. And it's interesting that we've learned that the FA said that the contract was signed on October the 8th, because it does start to put slightly different context on some of Carsley's comments over the weekend, where he seemed to be talking himself out of the job or tying himself in knots when it came to being definitive about whether he really wanted it and whether he wanted to take it on full time. And it appears to us now that he must have known, or at least had a strong inkling, that it was going to be Tuchel. But I think Tuchel will be more demanding of the FA. I think he will be not difficult, but I think it'll be tougher to control than Southgate was. I don't think that's a bad thing. And I can genuinely see this being a pretty good fit. I think there's no doubt, even though Tuchel he wasn't 100% fulfilled at any of the clubs he was at. He didn't fully nail it. He didn't properly kill it, but he has got a very strong record and he's got a good resume when it comes to the clubs that he's managed. And I do feel like this could be a really good fit.
Okay, fantastic, Phil. Thank you so much for your contribution. And also thank you to everyone for their contribution on today's pod. Jack, David, Liam, Seb as well. We'll be back tomorrow for some more from the world of football. For more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.